In 1986, I made my first visit to Korea at a time when Korea had already become a major international competitor, and for the first time in its post-war history, was running large trade and current account surplus. The message I brought on my trip was simple, that Korea was becoming a major international economic player, had to therefore increasingly play a cooperative role in managing the world economy, and indeed had to start playing a leadership role to assure that the economic order would prosper and continue. Now, at the time, that was a very new idea to most Koreans. Indeed, it was not a very welcome idea to most Koreans. And after my first day of that visit, my host, who was head of one of the Korean think tanks, told me the next morning that he had received 43 phone calls from outraged Korean compatriots complaining that he had brought this wild man to Korea who was proposing all sorts of crazy things for Korean policy. My host was deeply worried that he was going to lose his job or worse for having invited me. And his terror was enhanced by the fact that our first meeting on my second day was in the Blue House with the economic secretary to the president of Korea. That secretary turned out to be Segang-il. And when I went to meet with him for the very first time in my life that he and I had met, he shocked my host, and to some extent me, by saying, "Dr. Bergsten, I greatly appreciate the message you have brought to Korea. It is time for us to start contemplating a substantial change in our position and role in the world economy. Would you please go on primetime television with me tonight to start explaining that to the American public?" And so began, I think, Korea's ascendance to the pivotal role in the global economic order that it plays today. Fast forward to 2010, almost 25 years later. When the G20 decided to hold its first ever summit in an emerging market economy, it of course chose Korea. And the president of Korea, quite naturally, chose Dr. Segang-il to lead Korea's participation in that seminal event. Those summits of G20 at the time were crucial to enable the world to recover from the global financial crisis. The previous year's summit in London had been essential in digging out of the threat to global depression. Segang-il, as chairman of the summit in the following year, played a key role already in planning the London summit. But the Seoul summit in 2010 made history on its own when, among other things, it negotiated a seminal, long-delayed reform of the International Monetary Fund to dramatically increase the positions of China and other emerging markets to begin to improve the governance system of the world economy, make it more equitable, make it more legitimate, and therefore strengthen the very foundations of the global economic order. I and our Peterson Institute in Washington were extremely pleased to see all these developments and indeed to support and work with them. We had the great privilege and pleasure of hosting Dr. Segang-il as a visiting fellow at the Peterson Institute, then the Institute for International Economics, after he left his service in government in the late 1980s. He wrote a fantastic book at the time while he was with us called Korea in the World Economy. And then when he came back, he created the Institute for Global Economics, whose 30th anniversary we celebrate today. Over the years, his IGE and our PIIE held many seminars, conferences, and events together, working together to try to strengthen the world economy, the relations between our countries, and the constructive role that our countries could play in the world economy as a whole. Dr. Sagan chose a very wise strategy for his IGE to try to educate and inform the Korean public, Korean policymakers, Korean business on the role that Korea could play in its own interest and the interest of the world economy as a whole by becoming the constructive actor and leader that it did over those years. It was my pleasure to speak at the opening session of the IGE back in February of 1993, and we continued to work together extensively in the following years. One of the things we worked on was a brainchild of the previous speaker today, now Prime Minister Han Duck-soo. When Prime Minister Han Duck-soo was Trade Minister Han Duck-soo in the year 2000, he approached me with a suggestion. He asked if our Institute for International Economics would conduct a study of the possibility of creating a free trade agreement between Korea and the United States. That too was a completely new idea. It had no support in either Korea or the United States at that time. Indeed, the Korean business community was hostile to the idea, didn't like it at all. But Han Duck-soo had a vision. He asked us to study it. We did so in a study led by my colleague, Jeffrey Schott, who is with you at this conference in Seoul today. We began to then educate our own public, Korean public. Many conferences between us and the IGE helped to promote that idea. And one of the people who picked it up and ran with it and completed it was a subsequent speaker on today's program, Robert Zoellick, who at the time was the United States Trade Representative. It took 12 years from the time that Trade Minister Han Duck-soo suggested the idea to the time that KORUS was implemented in 2012, at a time when Ambassador Han Duck-soo was in Washington and able to sign the requisite documents to bring the KORUS into place. It sometimes takes time, but think tanks do have impact, and people who drive history like Han Duck-soo, Il Sagan, made sure that it happened over time. Now that's a thumbnail sketch, very selective, of the last 30 years. What about the next 30 years? Where is the world economy going? And where does Korea fit into that picture? I believe that the pivotal issue that will determine the course of the world economy over the next several decades, indeed, perhaps the entire 21st century, will be the outcome of the competition for global economic leadership now going on between the United States and China. China has become the first real challenger to United States supremacy in the global economic order in over 100 years. Since the United States became the world's premier economy around the time of the First World War, it has never had a serious rival or challenger. But Korea certainly has done that. China has certainly done that. And China now poses a major challenge both to US leadership and to the future functioning of the global economic order. As a clear challenger for global supremacy, China raises the famous issue of the Thucydides trap, the inherent conflict between an incumbent power, the United States in this case, and a rising power, China in this case, for global leadership. It poses the critical issue of whether they can reconcile their challenge in a peaceful way. A team at Harvard has identified 16 cases of such challenges between incumbents and competitors over the last several centuries, and concluded that in 12 of those 16 cases, the result was war. We obviously hope that will not be the case now. It has not always been the case, but it is a real risk. And we have to note that we already have had, for the last 5 years, a trade and technology war between the United States and its traditional allies on the one hand, and China on the other. So already in the economic sphere, there is real conflict. And there is tendency toward a new Cold War and a risk that it could become even worse over the coming years and decades. So the huge challenge to the world economy and the world more broadly is to push that confrontation in a constructive direction. The political scientists have something called power transition theory, which posits that the most dangerous time in that inherent conflict between rising and incumbent power is the period of overtaking, when the rising power is overtaking the incumbent in key respects. China has already overtaken the United States in terms of GDP and purchasing power parity, in terms of trade levels, in terms of foreign exchange reserves, in terms of impact on global economic growth as a whole. So in many respects, China has already passed the United States and will do so in others over the next decade or so. But I don't think it matters too much who's ahead a few $1 trillion of GDP or production of semiconductors. The basic point is that China is now the rough equivalent of the United States in terms of global economic power. And that does pose the question then of how to resolve the Thucydides trap in a peaceful way. And in our economic domain, how to welcome China into the global economic leadership in a way that is both constructive and cooperative, and in a way that endorses and preserves the great benefits from the global economic order of the last 75 years and the values that all of us in the democratic world hold dear. The rise of China, which is a risen power already, as well as a rising power, means that the United States can no longer provide the kind of global economic leadership that it has in the past 50 years or so. The U.S. always relied to a large extent to the support of its traditional allies, notably including Korea, of course. But now, even that group will be unable to provide adequate leadership without the full participation of China. Issues like climate change, fighting pandemics, restoring the openness of the trading system and away from the trade wars of the last 5 years, resolving the current debt problems of many emerging and developing countries, which requires Chinese participation to be successfully resolved. So all those issues require a new leadership construct in which China joins the traditional leadership to play that role. The last time we had a transition in global economic leadership, the result was a disaster. It was in the 1930s, and economic historian Charles Kindleberger, in fact, attributed the Great Depression and World War II, which followed it, to the collapse of international economic cooperation in the early 1930s. At that time, the traditional leading country, Great Britain, which had led the first era of globalization in the 19th century and into the early 20th century, Great Britain was exhausted and could no longer have the capability to lead the global economy. The rising power, the United States at the time, was unwilling to lead the global economy in a constructive way, and indeed made the crisis worse with the Smoot-Hawley tariff, with its competitive devaluation in 1933, with its torpedoing of the London Economic Conference in 1933 that sought a cooperative response to the spiraling Great Depression already underway at the time. And so the failure to resolve the inherent conflict between rising power and incumbent power brought the global economy and indeed the world as a whole to its knees, even when those two countries were on the whole friendly, culturally compatible, and allies in the wars that preceded and succeeded the economic breakdown. So the challenge we face today is, of course, even greater, where the United States and China have many strong differences, are in different parts of the world, have different per capita incomes, have different economic systems, have different political systems, and therefore face an enormous challenge in being able to resolve the Thucydides trap without conflict. They also, with the help of Korea and the other middle powers in the world, must be able to resolve the Kindleberger trap, the failure to bring the global economic system through a cooperative transition, as happened so drastically, so dramatically in the 1930s, and which we must avoid today unless we are to again court disaster. Now, China has shown on numerous occasions its willingness to provide leadership for the global economic system during the Asian financial crisis, particularly during the global financial crisis 15 years ago, on some occasions in dealing with climate change. Recently, just last summer at the Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization, China and the United States got together to successfully resolve technical problems over the patenting of COVID vaccines, and therefore permitted the WTO to have a successful ministerial and sustain the institutional foundation of the global economic order. But the challenges are enormous. And the big policy challenge for all of us, including Korea at this point in time, is to find a way to achieve cooperative arrangements between China and its allies, the United States and its allies, to work through these two traps in a successful way. Now, that problem is finally compounded by the fact that the US and its friends and China and its friends have some pretty irreconcilable differences on a number of security and values issues. Taiwan, the South China Sea, the treatment of the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, a whole range of issues where I do not think the differences between the two groups are going to go away anytime soon. And therefore, I think what is essential is to find a way through which we can cooperate on economic issues while maintaining our principled and security-based differences on other issues. That is what I call and propose functional decoupling. Functional decoupling means that we agree to disagree on a lot of issues with China and its friends, particularly security and human rights and values issues. But at the same time, we believe it is imperative to achieve pragmatic cooperation on the economic issues that are in all of our interests, must be pursued, and must be successfully resolved unless the world is to spiral into economic depression and global conflict. Functional decoupling is very different from the national decoupling that is often discussed, and in fact was mentioned already this morning. National decoupling means the countries as a whole would separate and go their separate ways. I believe that would be a disaster. It would be hugely costly. It would likely increase the risk that the Thucydides trap would close. It is to be rejected under all possible circumstances. In favor, I would argue, of functional decoupling, where we make a conscious decision to treat different issues in different ways. Is it feasible? Of course. It happens all the time. Countries decouple different parts of their relationships with each other. As I mentioned, the US and China got together last summer to rescue the ministerial conference of the World Trade Organization. They got together toward the end of last year on some highly technical matters concerning the financial registration of Chinese firms in the US, permitting Chinese financing and business to continue in the United States. They got together at the Glasgow conference on climate change to make pragmatic progress on that crucial issue. Just last week, Yi Gang, the governor of the People's Bank of China, proposed in Washington that China would join the common framework, the G20 approach to dealing with debt rescheduling for the developing countries who are now in such debt distress. So yes, it is quite feasible for the United States and China and the two groups more broadly to get together. The key is to recognize that the economic issues need to be put in the basket of cooperation between the United States and China. The Biden administration's construct perfectly permits for that outcome. Even before he was in office, and certainly since, President Biden and his top lieutenants have talked very explicitly about putting relations between the US and China into three separate baskets. One, admittedly, of confrontation, one of day-to-day competition, and one of cooperation. And in that context, the speech given last week by Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen is critically important. I hope all of you read or read about the speech that Secretary Yellen gave at Johns Hopkins SAIS Graduate School last week, where she explicitly said that economic decoupling between the two countries would be disastrous for the world. I quote word for word the most important sentence. Secretary Yellen said, "It is important that we make progress on global issues regardless of our other disagreements." Regardless of our other disagreements. That paves the way for the kind of functional decoupling on a sustained, consistent, and policy basis for which I am calling. Now, it's crucial for the US to approach a stance like that. There is a bipartisan consensus in the United States, including in our Congress, as many have noted, that China is a real threat to the United States and poses real risks. On that, there is bipartisan agreement in the United States. Not many issues have bipartisan agreement, that one does. But there is no agreement in the Congress or anywhere else on what to do about it, on how to resolve that threat, that challenge, in a constructive and positive way. Indeed, Congress has already taken a number of domestic steps, largely driven by the challenge from China. All three of President Biden's key legislative successes of the last year, the big infrastructure bill of a year ago, the CHIPS bill last summer to promote US R&D and the semiconductor industry, the more recent bill, huge bill to support the development of sustainable energy production. All those bills have their shortcomings, as you know, with protectionist and discriminatory provisions. But in broad strategic terms, they do represent efforts by the United States to mount domestic responses to the China challenge, rather than lashing out at China, extending trade wars, pursuing all that. But that is the issue, whether that distinction can be made and sustained, and will China itself participate actively in that kind of outcome in order to cooperatively resolve the world's problems. What would functional decoupling look like if we were to get it? Well, I can only give a couple of examples. I wrote a book last year, published it. It's called The United States and China, the Competition for Global Economic Leadership. It gives a lot of examples, but I'll just give you a couple. Over the long run, what I believe we should be aiming for in the International Monetary Fund is essentially equal representation between the three equal powers. the United States, China, and in that case, the Euro area. The initiative that Korea sponsored so effectively back in 2010 that I mentioned greatly increased China's role in the IMF, but it's still only 1/3 that of the United States or the Europeans. Over time, I believe those shares and quotas should be equalized. China should be given an equal seat at the table, assuming, of course, that it will cooperate constructively with the rules, including rules that it might want to change to make the governance system more legitimate. In the short run, the obvious thing is to eliminate the US-China trade war. That could be done on a fully reciprocal basis, just as the trade war itself was reciprocal. If the US would eliminate its tariffs on China, China would, I'm sure, reciprocally eliminate its tariffs on US products. Nobody would be capitulating to the other. Neither country would be charged at home with selling out or capitulating to the other or going soft on the other. It'd be a reciprocal deal and work out in that way and take a lot of pressure off both economies and greatly improve the prospects for global trading relationships and economic systems more broadly. So there's a lot that can be done if functional decoupling, rather than being episodic, ad hoc, item by item, could become the policy of the day. And I believe it's in that direction that all of us need to move as we look to the future of the world economy. Final point. What does all this imply for Korea? Korea is, of course, literally, as well as figuratively, right in the middle of the conflict between the United States and China, and thus has an enormous interest in finding a constructive resolution. I don't need to tell you in Seoul about that. But I think Korea is in a unique position to help achieve those outcomes. It, of course, has trade agreements, both with China and with the United States. It has played a leadership role in the past, as in the G20 a decade ago, and in a number of succeeding issues on climate change and trade relations and financial matters as well. So China, I think, is extremely well positioned. How about if China would decide itself to join the CPTPP and urge both China and the United States to join along with it? And maybe China and the United States, in that multilateral regional context with some helpful friends involved, could work out some of the trade differences between China and the United States that have caused the tension and risk of breakdown in the global trading system. I think Korea could once again, along with other middle powers, the Europeans, Japan, Australia, a few others, but Korea, I think, could play a very major role in this whole process. I started with a story. Let me close with a story. In his first year in office, President Obama, like President Biden now, did not want to do anything on trade policy. He knew it was divisive within the Democratic Party. He did not want to raise difficulties for his other priorities. And so he wanted to stay totally away from trade policy, the way President Biden has, quite frankly, in his first 2+ years in office. But President Obama got a visit late in his first year in office from the late Lee Kuan Yew, the fabled Prime Minister of Singapore, who was probably Asia's greatest statesman in the 20th century and into the early 21st century. And Lee Kuan Yew rather forcefully impressed upon President Obama, and I'm quoting him almost verbatim, unless you, Mr. President, start re-engaging economically with Asia, you will turn the continent over to the Chinese. President Obama fortunately got the point. He re-engaged the United States in what was then the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. The US helped drive that negotiation to a successful outcome over the next 5 years. Unfortunately, it faltered with Democrats in the Congress and, of course, President Trump. But it did represent a re-engagement by the United States due to the intercession of Lee Kuan Yew with the American president. I don't know if President Yoon, on his current trip to Washington, could weigh in with President Biden in a similar way and replicate what Lee Kuan Yew achieved in the past in getting the U.S. to come to its senses and re-engage economically in Asia in a meaningful way and respond to the two risks, the two traps that I have identified. But whether it can be done tomorrow in the White House or not, or whether it takes a little more time, I would hope Korea would play its major role that it can in trying to resolve these global problems. I'm sure that, as in the past, Segang-il, his Institute for Global Economics, can once again play a leadership role in bringing Korea, Asia, and the world together in a cooperative and constructive way. And it has been a great privilege and pleasure for me to have a chance to share these thoughts with you today. Thank you very much.